In episode 57 of Mobycast, we look ahead towards DockerCon 2019, discuss what to expect, and throw down a few predictions. Welcome to Mobycast, a weekly conversation about cloud-native development, AWS, and building distributed systems. Let's jump right in.
Welcome, Chris. It's another episode of Mobycast.
Hey, John. Good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you. So it's just you and I today. Rich is spending some family time, and we are out of practice because you were on vacation.
I was in a whole different time zone.
A whole different time zone. Did you go to Montana?
That would be a different time zone, and kind of wish it was only one time zone away, or at least right now, right? My body's it's massively confused, my internal clock. So I was in Italy, 9 hours difference between Seattle time, and then ended up having a unexpected multi-day layover in Chicago. So my body doesn't know when to go to sleep, when to wake up, when to eat. Everything's kind of out of whack. It was
probably doesn't need to eat, right? You did plenty of that in Italy.
Yes, I did. I definitely carbo loaded for sure. But cool. I worked it off we walked, and so according to my Apple Watch, I think it was about 80 miles total and spread over like 7 days.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's really great. Yeah, no trips to Italy here. We just did Kelsa's stuff and yeah, tried to hold down the fort while you were away. Not an easy task. But here we are back, and today we're going to talk about DockerCon. It's coming up in 2 weeks. Well, by the time you're listening, dear listener, it'll be 1 week. So it's coming up in a week, and you'll be there. And this is your third one, Chris?
This will be my fourth, actually.
Fourth DockerCon.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. It's I hadn't gone to conferences for quite some time, and then really DockerCon was the one that I kind of got back into it with, and that was back in 2016 in the Seattle version. So it was one of those things that was super easy for me to go to. There was no travel. That's coincidentally when I first started using Docker. So it was just awesome timing. So I started using Docker in like January 2016. And then the conference, I think I can't remember if it was April or I think it was June actually. So it was just perfect timing. That edition I walked away from that thing. Wow, this is a great conference. This was really good.
Very cool. So yeah, and it's changed over the years, but let's talk about what's coming up. And then maybe later in the conversation, we can talk about how it's changed over the years. So what are you expecting this year? What's going to happen?
Yeah, this year's going to be interesting, and just interesting in that I don't expect anything too terribly dramatic. So last year was a big kind of shift in culture and content. We talked about that on the previous episode of Mobycast when we recapped the 2018 version. But right. Big changes happened in 2018 with Docker, with the departure of both Ben, the previous CEO, as well as Solomon, the CTO. So kind of like a 1-2 punch there, changing of the guard, and brought in new CEO, some other new management. And it was really kind of, previously Docker was all about, I think, innovation and just really just lots of different directions and technology. And they absolutely made some missteps there and kind of like trying to be an overambitious, but at least there was a lot of excitement. There was a lot going on, a lot of innovation. Last year was made very, very clear that like, okay, new management coming in, Steve Singh, the CEO, it's all about Docker as a business and really finding what that business model is. And so a really kind of a dramatic reduction in the innovation, the number of product announcements that they had, much, much less. And just really loud and clear that focus on like how, what's the business model, making money, turning, really having this thing grow up and become understanding that it is a business, right? It's not a technology innovation lab, if you will. It's like it has to make money. So I really expect this year to be more of the same, right? So right. I don't expect a lot of new product announcements. I expect them to, continue to focus on the enterprise edition of Docker, focus on hybrid environments, focus on legacy apps and monoliths, and how do you easily, give that support to the enterprise companies so they can containerize their existing applications without rewrites, and continue the big bear hug around Kubernetes.
Right. Yeah. Wouldn't you expect it's kind of like lots of education, lots of best practices, and lots of hey, look at this is, here's a kind of unique way to use this existing thing to do something that you might not have thought of before, and not so much announcement, none of those types of sessions, or maybe very few of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely expect a lot of lather, rinse, repeat, and just more practical, like how do you use the stuff? I mean, and to some extent, what else are you going to do, with Docker? Like, it's very robust, stable, it's mature, it's kind of has everything you need for, containerization. So in that respect, there's not a tremendous amount of new tooling or product around it, unless it's kind of driven more from a business model standpoint. So
sure.
Yeah.
So we see, I have in front of me here that DockerCon has grown over the years. 500 in 2014, 4,000 people, 5,500. Last year, 6,000. More people are using Docker. It's still growing. So do you expect DockerCon to actually be bigger, or do you think it might shrink a little bit this year?
So for sure, when they release numbers, it's not going to shrink, right? Regardless of whatever the real numbers are, right? They're not going to. So last year it was, I think, about 6,000, and the previous year was 5,500. Right. So not a huge jump. And so this year I would expect they'll probably say something like there's 7,000 attendees.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of doubt that will be the case. It's at the same venue. It's in San Francisco at Moscone. And
fun ways of counting attendees might be like, oh, well, if you're a gold sponsor, then everybody in this organization of your company is an attendee.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Amazon's here, so 200,000. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, they're definitely not nearly as big as some of the other conferences around.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's a different flavor. You have someone like AWS and its conference with reInvent. It's really focused. It's kind of a commercial conference, right? Versus DockerCon, especially over the last 4 years, has transition more to like this has more the feel of like open source and community and whatnot. So I think that kind of limits the attendees, if you will. It feels a lot like some of the O'Reilly conferences, like OSCON.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. So what's the kind of layout of the conference? What do you expect there? How long is it? That kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty compressed, especially compared to something like reInvent. So it's really 2 days long. So it's officially, I think it's 4 days, but the first day is kind of like a pre-day with there's paid workshops that you can attend. The fourth day is a recap of popular breakout sessions. And so it's really the two middle days there, the Tuesday and Wednesday are the core days of the conference. So each day starts off with a keynote session, and then it's followed by the breakout sessions. So those basically 2 days of full content, and then some additional stuff on the tail ends at the beginning and the end. About 100 breakout sessions, which is, I mean, it's in a way, it's kind of,
right?
Yeah, it's kind of refreshing, right? You can actually look through the catalog, register, and it takes you 10 minutes versus reInvent. I think I spent probably 5 to 10 hours going through that, trying to line up my agenda for it.
Yeah,
there was 2,000 plus.
With 3 weeks of FOMO.
Yeah.
Nonstop.
Yeah. So definitely much smaller, more manageable, and more compressed.
Right on. So I'm going to actually skip a little part of the outline. And since we were just talking about sessions, maybe you can talk about the tracks.
And this has remained pretty consistent too across the various DockerCons. So, it's kind of a mix of kind of like high level stuff, some low level stuff, and then kind of everything in between. So some of the kind of the main tracks they have a Docker Tech Talks. And so these are sessions that go deep on the products and technology that make up the Docker platform. So pretty hands-on, pretty pragmatic information. There's a Docker for Developers track, which is really focused on, the developers that are using Docker on their machines, on their laptops, right? How do they really get the most? So they're using, the tools like Docker Compose and Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows and whatnot. Then they have a track Docker for IT, infrastructure, and ops. So that's your DevOps type stuff, right? Like, how do you actually use Docker in production? How do you deploy things? How do you run them? How do you maintain them? How do you monitor them? Those kinds of things. They have a customer case studies track. So obviously this is customers that are using Docker, and they get up there and talk about how they're using it, the benefits they get, kind of inspire other folks to do the same. they have a black belt session track. And so this is like just goes usually really deep into the guts, the internals of the Docker platform and related things. I've spent a lot of the previous DockerCons in black belt sessions, and I can definitely attest. They usually go like really deep. And the other thing to point out too, DockerCon, their sessions are 40 minutes long versus like reInvent 60 minutes long.
Yeah.
And that 20 minutes makes a big difference. So especially with these like these black belt sessions, 40 minutes going really deep, like pulling apart like how networking works inside Docker, or how does, storage work and device, all the drivers and whatnot, to get all that within 40 minutes. And they usually go through like their slide decks are like 100 slides long. And so you just feel like you're just like fire hose.
So they're not actually trying to give you a little less content so that it's more manageable. They're just trying to shove it all into 40 minutes.
It's absolutely what it feels like, right? It feels like it's 60 minutes or even more of content in a 40-minute session. So, So you have to kind of like be on your toes and really kind of pay attention. Otherwise, you're gonna miss it. A few other tracks they have an ecosystem track, which is, just the whole community that makes up Docker, and so all the vendors and other open source projects and partners and whatnot, which again is kind of interesting. I mean, you don't really see that. I mean, you see a little bit of that at something like a reInvent, but not nearly as much devoted as you'll see at something like DockerCon. And then they have a transform track, which is kind of a bit more of a wild card, kind of open-ended one, where it's just like, how has this enabled various, transformations or changed like culture and processes and things like that.
Right.
Hey there, this is Rich. Please pardon this quick interruption. We recently passed an internal milestone of 30,000 listens, and I wanted to take a moment to thank you for the support. I was also hoping to encourage you to head on over to iTunes to leave us a review. Positive feedback and constructive criticism are both incredibly important to us. So give us an idea of how we're doing, and we'll promise to keep publishing new episodes every week. Okay, let's dive back in.
One of the tracks there kind of caught my ear because it reminded me of a tweet I saw from Claire Liguri yesterday. She was asking people that develop with Docker how they interact with Docker on their machines while they're developing. And it was a poll. It was like, do you use Docker CLI? Do you use Docker Compose? Do you use some sort of IDE type of connectivity, like a button to run your container or other? And then, it was like 75% were Docker CLI, 20% was, or even more, was Docker Compose. And then very few people were on the other or the IDE capability. And she kind of shot back like, oh, kind of funny. I really enjoy using I think she might be using VS Code or something, or full on Visual Studio. I enjoy using that because it just automatically will attach my debugger to the container, to the process running inside the container. And that way I don't have to do that manually. And then I can have a debugger going. And it just kind of took me down this trip down memory lane of like times in my career where I've had a debugger available, then kind of gone to a technology where a debugger is not the way you code, and then going back with mobile development and Objective-C, and it's like, oh, the debugger is back. What a luxury. And then, off to Node.js. We're not doing debuggers right now anymore. And so kind of the whole thing of a debugger is that they're awesome. They're incredible. They're so cool when you have access to them, but they're also, painful to set up in certain situations. And Docker is one of those situations. And so, I would be curious for you to go snoop around that track and just see how mature that stuff is and whether it might make sense for our team to start doing that.
So I think we've kind of touched on this in previous episodes a bit, just the kind of like the Docker learning curve, and it kind of changes. You just have to kind of change the way you work a bit. But I mean, so debugging inside Docker, I mean, the tools have been there now for years. So VS Code, I think in 2017, they kind of show it off, just being able to debug running containers and hot reloading and all that kind of stuff. And so you can make all that work. It does take a little bit more, just you have to look into it and set it up and, just make it happen. And, I think it's whether or not it's something that you really need. Like you said, we've kind of, to some extent, gotten away from using your IDEs with integrated debugging and, stepping through code. I know me personally, like the first 20 years of my career, like debugger was like, I use Visual Studio, and using a debugger was integral to like what I was doing. Like I would almost always I would be just stepping through code as a way of just doing just unit testing or some integration testing, right? Just going through and making sure it was doing exactly what I expected it to be doing. And then when I switched over to Node in 2012, there really, like at that point, there really was no good debugger at all for Node. So it was like, all right, I went from this really nice integrated, IDE with integrated debugger and profiler and everything else. And now I have a text editor.
Right. Not to, I don't want to go too far down this, but like debuggers are more technologically advanced. Like the ability to really see what's happening in code is an advancement in technology that happened because people wanted to see that. And so going away from debuggers is a trade-off. It's like, well, I want these capabilities of this new language, and I want to be able to, in this new way of doing things, and I'm willing to give up my debugger for it. But if you can get the debugger back and sort of have the best of both worlds, and I know we've talked about the separation of like, having your container sort of not ever be allowed to have like a only works on my machine type setup. But if your IDE is really good at helping you manage that, like if your IDE helps you set up those walls and lets you debug fully, and then also lets you be confident that when you're releasing it, it's, you've taken away all those like little things that you don't want to release into production, such as, for example, a shared file system, then that could be a great thing. And I guess like my argument here is really, it comes down to things like, there have been times in my career where I've used a debugger and I've noticed, oh my God, I didn't realize that was happening. And I didn't realize it because the code was working, everything seemed happy, no problems, no unit tests saying that there was something wrong. But the debugger was like, oh my God, why is that file handle still around? I wouldn't have known that without this debugger or without a production outage. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. There's real value in debuggers.
Yeah, absolutely. And so maybe the net is it's like the tools are out there, whether you're doing Docker development or not. There's quite a bit of a tooling community, and you can do the debugging inside the container. You just need to do a little, just set it up, right? And learn how to do it, and it doesn't take that much time. So, So if you like debuggers and you really want that capability, you can have it with Docker. Just as a side, I think what happens with most people is that when they're to debug, they just debug it running outside of Docker, right? Which is kind of a big no-no.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of why I wanted you to poke around there, because I think that in terms of another thing we talk a lot about in Mobycast is like the care and feeding of your own tech career. And I think a lot of times developers kind of spend a lot of time like learning the new technologies, the new languages, and the new ops stuff. And then, before you know it, you haven't spent any time kind of updating your development process, like learning new, hotkeys in an IDE, or like trying out a new, more powerful development practice, right? Like that stuff it's like, I got my way, I like it, I'm just going to keep doing it that way. Mm-hmm. But updating that part of your skill set can be very valuable.
Indeed. Yep.
Cool. All right. So I think we've spent quite a bit of time here, but oh my goodness. Yeah, we just took a nice long detour. Where should we go next, Chris? Help us. Let's get this back.
Sure. So, I think, we've, definitely kind of mission accomplished in that, like, this is all about a preview show of DockerCon 2019. We've talked about a bit of like, some of the history, kind of what we kind of expect to this new one, some of what the content's like, the layout. This is, again, different than a bigger conference like reInvent. So in reInvent, like, it definitely makes sense to talk about like a lot of practical tips, and you need to pace yourself, and you need to, wear comfortable shoes and hydrate and sleep and all that kind of stuff. The good news here with DockerCon, it's just much more relaxed. It's not nearly as intense. It is a great conference with a lot of good technical content and pragmatic content. Lots of passionate people there that are really into it, and you can totally geek out. So from that standpoint, it's just a lot more manageable, and in some ways, maybe even a bit more enjoyable.
I want to ask you a really important question, because this could play into some future episodes of Mobycast, because we like to go through some talks. You've already started to look at your agenda, right? Are there any particular speakers that you're excited to hear?
Off the top of my head, not really, other than there's some talks from folks at Netflix, and there's one on just around container security. So theoretic and practical implementations of that at Netflix. So that's kind of interesting.
Do you happen to have in front of you who's giving that talk?
That is Michael Wardrop.
Ah, cool.
So, and there's a few other. There's one that's specifically around Node.js, and that's done by Brett Fisher, who's kind of one of the Docker captains and is a longtime member of the Docker community, and he's spoken before. There's the Dockerfile best practices one again, although this year it's done by a couple different folks. So there are a lot of the same speakers as before. I wouldn't be surprised if Abby Fuller's here again. But I'm going just to kind of like I'm interested to see, okay, what's new? What are some of the kind of like the pragmatic little tidbits that are going to make life a little bit easier, and also just kind of get the overall feel and flavor of like what's happening in the community and where it's going. So we've talked about this in the past about what's the future look like for Docker. Is it going to stay independent or is it going to get acquired? Are they going to figure out the business model? And then also this whole like just Kubernetes. So like last year was such a huge dramatic switch for them. And, previously they did kind of support Kubernetes or whatnot, but they were really focused on Swarm. And last year it was just Kubernetes was everywhere. This year, there weren't as many sessions that are around Kubernetes. However, if you go to the DockerCon website, the primary subtitle for it it's the DockerCon is the #1 container industry conference for all things Kubernetes, microservices, and DevOps.
Wow.
It doesn't even mention Docker.
That's hilarious.
So, they have they have like 8 or 9 paid workshops and at least 2 of those are on Kubernetes. So, Kubernetes, they've definitely doubled down on Kubernetes. It'll be interesting to see just where they go from there. And
it will be interesting because, Kubernetes has been getting a little bit of heat lately. I've seen sentiment turn against it pretty hard on Twitter. And just yesterday, I think, or maybe it was 2 days ago, Tinder released a tech blog basically going through the, millions of dollars in weeks and months that they spent moving over to Kubernetes and how difficult that was for them. And Kelsey Hightower, one of the Google Cloud people, said a while back that, a great use case for Kubernetes is if you have developers releasing applications that are kind of different and disparate into one area, kind of like if you're making your own platform as a service, look at Kubernetes. If you're not, don't. So that there are not, making a platform as a service, maybe some things that some enterprises do. Maybe a telecom company does that. Maybe, cable companies or big companies, big enterprises do that for sure. And they maybe do it on-prem and Kubernetes is right for them. But for everybody else, it's not. So it'll be interesting to see, if Docker, which we expect is really still trying to embrace the enterprise and trying to figure out how to monetize the enterprise, it would make sense for them to still be all about Kubernetes where it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, so Kubernetes kind of has some of the same problems now that AWS has. So we talked about with AWS, like the rapid pace of innovation, right? 1,000 releases a year, new services all the time. And it's just like, it's really hard to keep up. In a way, Kubernetes has the same issue, right? I mean, it is a huge beast. It's being added to constantly, and it's actually really hard to comprehend all of it, right? And to be well versed in the entire platform, or even in core pieces of it. Right. And so that's a big limiting factor in adoption by these folks that don't have 100+ person IT teams, engineering teams.
Exactly.
So it'll be interesting to see if Docker does something there to make it much more palatable and easy to work with, right? Without having to go spend months and months and months figuring out how to get Kubernetes to work and to run it reliably in production.
Yeah, that would be interesting. That could be our prediction. Maybe we could leave everybody with that if Docker is going to sort of resurrect itself, DockerCon is going to resurrect itself as like a place to be, that announcing some sort of onboarding ramp to Kubernetes that's realistic for smaller organizations would be potentially the way to do it. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, great talking to you. I hope you have a good time at the conference. And then when we get back, we're going to have so much to talk about.
You bet. All right. Sounds good.
Talk to you next week. Bye.
See ya. Bye.
Well, dear listener, you made it to the end. We appreciate your time and invite you to continue the conversation with us online. This episode, along with show notes and other valuable resources, is available at mobycast.fm/57. If you have any questions or additional insights, we encourage you to leave us a comment there. Thank you, and we'll see you again next week.